all you literary legends and luminaries. Welcome to another episode of Booksmart. Today's book is a heavy one. If I were an elementary school teacher, I'd tell you, put on your thinking caps. It is Pathological, the true story of 6 misdiagnoses by Sarah Fay. This book was published last year, so it reflects the current state of our society in that we are much more willing to discuss mental health and not create a stigma around mental disorders. I picked up this book because it intrigued me. I have battled panic attacks forever, and I know how easily my brain will set off red alerts and how much effort it takes to calm those sirens in my head. Plus, as a woman, sometimes I feel like my doctors dismiss my concerns and don't fully listen to me, so I wanted to read about the author's misdiagnoses and how she handled them. The book wasn't quite what I had expected, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It definitely didn't disappoint when it comes to information. Pathological is jam-packed. So much so, she gives us an index and notes at the end of her memoir, which you don't see very often in memoirs. Fay states in her prologue, "This isn't a classic mental illness memoir. The end result is a mesh of memoir, research, analysis, and application to her own mental health experiences." So let's start with her 6 diagnoses that she lists both at the beginning and at the end of her book. So these are what she was given as a diagnosis. Anorexia, major depressive disorder, anxiety disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and bipolar disorder. While she addresses each diagnosis clearly, along with her symptoms and what precipitated it all, she doesn't always explain how they ended up being a misdiagnosis, which in itself is a little confusing. I was thoroughly confused for about the first 50 pages until I figured out all that she was throwing at me. So she begins with anorexia, which she was diagnosed with in 8th grade. While she traces her misdiagnoses chronologically, there's quite a few time gaps, and I found myself a bit confused because in one sentence she was dealing with anorexia and then poof, she's eating again. She didn't develop the cure, as she calls it, all that much. I was even confused as to the misdiagnosis part. She admits to not eating, which is a pretty big indicator of anorexia, yet she just sort of drops it. Then she develops other symptoms like stomach pains and migraines, which she then never explains conclusively the cause behind such physical symptoms. And this is why it's a bit baffling, because this is kind of how she does it throughout the story. So I'm left unsure which part she believed and which part she didn't. Or does she want her readers to see that she was never diagnosed appropriately, or what? It's unclear. To further confuse me, she becomes an alcoholic after she suddenly starts eating again. Alcoholism isn't one of her diagnoses, yet she spends ample time on it and also discusses addictive disorders. From the sound of it, she drinks rather heavily, even to the point of blacking out, yet the timeline isn't clear for how long she drank. Then she just quit, and that was it. If you've drank that heavily for that long, sure, maybe you don't need any sort of treatment or 12-step program, but wouldn't you go through severe withdrawal? Once again, confusing in its vagueness. Within her personal experience, as the misdiagnoses continue, she integrates within her narrative the DSM information on each diagnosis. And that's the part that is mind-blowing. The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. According to the author, this is not science-based or medically sound. They are only suggestions. A panel of psychiatrists, psychologists, and other healthcare workers get together and group and categorize all the disorders, eliminating some and adding many. Medical doctors then use such info in the DSM to diagnose patients, although family practitioners have little expertise in mental health, and there's no consistent way to diagnose and no consistent form of treatment. She applies her symptoms to the DSM descriptions and explains how doctors arrived at her diagnosis. Yet the DSM changes, it gets updated and revised, including more and more symptoms and grouping others into a wider umbrella. As you may know, Asperger's is no longer separated from autism. Now everything is grouped together on the spectrum. While I knew a little bit about the DSM, because I went through a time in junior high where I wanted to be a psychiatrist who specialized in multiple personality disorder. I learned just about a decade ago that Sybil was all a hoax. Multiple personality disorder is an incredibly rare condition, yet thousands of people were being diagnosed with it in the 1980s. To eliminate the notoriety of it, the DSM changed it to dissociative identity disorder. If it's so rare, how come psychiatrists were diagnosing it at such high rates? Fay doesn't address multiple personality disorder in her book, so this is all coming from me, but as she is describing the problems with the DSM, I am remembering all I had read and researched years ago. Ultimately, the DSM is arbitrary with its descriptions and categorization, and doctors then use it at their discretion. For instance, she describes bereavement. The DSM doesn't include loss of pet, job, or house, only death of a human. So anyone who presents a lengthy sadness, say over the death of their pet, could easily be diagnosed with major depressive disorder. Common sense would tell anyone that there's a clear cause and effect to the depression, yet the author was then put on an antidepressant after her cat died. Fay never thinks of rejecting the diagnosis or the treatment. Doctors are right and medications will help. Drug companies advertise on television. They profit from doctors' diagnoses. The chemical imbalance theory of mental illness has been debunked. I remember not too long ago reading the scientific article that stated this, and yet it just disappeared. The media seemed to ignore it, which I found shocking. In Fay's research, she found that the use and effectiveness of prescriptions for depression and anxiety is, and I quote, a publicly sanctioned cultural myth. In fact, drugs may cause the chemical imbalances that result in anxiety and psychosis. Here's a passage in her book that sums this up nicely in regards to how a doctor and patient might communicate or interact with one another. So she says, here's the problem. Mental health professionals don't say to their patients, oh, by the way, that whole chemical imbalance theory we talked about all those years and staked our reputations on and continue to let you believe isn't true. How likely would a patient be to adopt a diagnosis if a doctor said, well, you may have clinical depression, but we don't know what causes it, and it's certainly not caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain, and in fact, we can't scientifically validate that depression actually is, but here, take this prescription for a drug that may work, though we don't really know how, and which may have terrible side effects, and which you may have to continue taking because the withdrawal can be vicious. You know, how is a patient supposed to respond to that? And how is a doctor supposed to address a patient's symptoms? Food for thought. I'm the type of person who reads the fine print on everything. I don't like it if a doctor gives me an antibiotic because then I may not be able to lay out in the sun and read, or my tummy may not like it. So I question everything a doctor wants me to take, but many people don't. They take what is prescribed. The author did as told until a bit later on in the book. Then she's on multiple medications and is told conflicting information from her doctors. For each diagnosis, she sees herself in the symptoms. Even if she demonstrated certain symptoms, does that automatically mean she has OCD or bipolar disorder? Other symptoms she may not have readily experienced, but now she applies to herself thanks to the diagnosis she was given. The power of suggestion is strong. I have to be careful when I used to watch ER and Grey's Anatomy. I think I have every condition known to man, whatever is on the episode. COVID was particularly challenging for me. I never got it, at least that I know of, but I thought I had every symptom. I'd go around sniffing everything from my lotion to anything I'd Febreze just to make sure I could smell. Hysteria stems from such power of suggestion. Another topic she doesn't really address, but that hysteria concept may have strengthened her argument even more. Between all her diagnoses and medications, she even has suicidal ideations. As the book progressed, I felt her downward spiral. Her life appeared to revolve around doctor's visits, medication adjustments, various physical symptoms, which led to more mental distress, or perhaps the other way around. I was exhausted just reading about her experiences. I can only imagine what it was like to live through. Because the author takes such a definitive stand on the DSM and doesn't hold back her views, I found her ambiguity surrounding some of her misdiagnoses a bit frustrating though. I guess I was hoping each one would conclude. Instead, they just sort of drop off, replaced by another one. Maybe that's how each one got resolved. It was merely overtaken by a new diagnosis. I don't know. I can't really answer that. Between her own personal narrative and research regarding the DSM, the author also throws punctuation at her reader. As an English teacher, I rather enjoyed reading about commas and brackets and whatnot, and she used such punctuation marks to symbolize aspects of each diagnosis. Yet as a whole, I thought such information just muddled more prominent info. That about diagnosing mental illness and the use of the DSM. The punctuation stuff overcomplicated an already very complicated subject. This book was not an easy read. I felt like I needed a highlighter and should have been annotating the text as I read, which isn't a bad thing. I actually enjoy that piece of reading, but it's just not a book you should take to the beach. It's one of those that is going to prompt a lot of conversation, which is a good way to learn. If you have dealt with mental illness, either personally or via someone you love, you have to read this book. It will make you think about how doctors approach mental illness and how they are quick to prescribe medications and how that whole process affects those needing help. Even if you don't agree with her conclusions, the book will make you question some really important things about mental health and treatment and all the medication that society is consuming. I know it certainly made me think. Even though Fay's conclusion wasn't as defined as I may have liked, I loved how she brought her story full circle. She writes, I entered my pathological life through one book, The Best Little Girl in the World, and exited through another, the DSM. As readers, I think we can all appreciate the power of books. That's all for this episode. Thanks for watching. Remember, here at Booksmart, my goal is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.